So in the last video, we talked about the banks. We talked about issuing banks that are issuing the cards. Then we talked about acquiring banks that are getting the money from the issuing bank, dispersing it to the business owner. Now, if you really start to think about that, and if you remember in the very first video, I gave the example of when I went to LA and California and used my debit card for my bank in Pennsylvania. So my bank in Pennsylvania was the issuing bank. The bank out in California was the acquiring bank. Well, how did the acquiring bank in California know that they need to reach out to the issuing bank in Pennsylvania to get my money, right? How does all this work? I mean, you think about it, it's insanely complicated to get all this money moving around the right way. Well, that's what the card brands do. The card brands are the ones who tie all of this stuff together. So these are companies like Visa, MasterCard, Discover, JCB, American Express, and a host of other networks on the PIN debit side like NYCE, Pulse, Excel, and many others. So what these networks do is these networks work with the bank. And so these networks, the way I like to think of these brands or networks is that really it's like a centralized database of cardholder information that allows anybody that has access to it to get an authorization through their system, right? And so it's a way of managing security. They're making sure that all this cardholder information stays secure, but they're also then working with the issuing banks and the acquiring banks to kind of pull this whole network together and make everything work. Now, the beauty of the model for Visa and MasterCard and others is that really doing that now today really is mostly a technology play. In other words, at the very beginning, they literally had slips of paper that you would fill out and you would send in, and it got really, really complicated, labor intensive. Of course, today, this is all digitized. So there's really not nearly as much work involved for them to manage all this stuff, but there is a lot on the technical side. They're always developing. And the other thing the card brands do that's just as important, if not more important, is that the card brands are managing a brand. They're promoting a brand, right? Like, this whole process doesn't do any good if nobody wants to get the card. So if consumers don't actually use the card, then none of these benefits happen. The industry doesn't exist. So the consumer has to actually use the card. And so early on, keep in mind, nobody knew what Visa was at the beginning, right? Like that was a new thing at the very beginning. And so over time, Visa, MasterCard, and these other card brands have really done a great job of promoting themselves to consumers and this idea of buying on credit, using their cards, and kind of the benefits of doing that. And so they manage that brand as well. And so really for the card brands, they have this network they're doing, and then they're also doing this branding. So how do the card brands make money? Well, we talked about how the issuing bank makes money off the interchange fee. So the bank is collecting the interchange fees. Visa and MasterCard are collecting two types of fees. One is a network access brand usage fee, and then the other is an assessment. Now, you're going to see a lot of different words for this on the, on the statement. Sometimes you'll see a network access fee. Sometimes you'll see dues and assessments. You're going to see different terminology, and we'll get that more in different modules talking about reading statements and things like that. But the idea here is that the network access brand usage fee is a tiny per item fee. It's usually going to be around 2 cents at the time of this recording. So they get about 2 cents every time somebody runs a transaction. Okay. Now you might think to yourself, oh my, 2 cents, that's not very much. Well, when you're running billions of dollars in transactions daily, hundreds of millions of individual transactions a day, 2 cents really can add up to a lot, right? So they're doing 2 cents. Now then, in addition to that, they are also collecting assessments. Now the assessment is around 12 to 14, some of them now 15 basis points. And so it just depends. Different card brands have different ones, but 12 to 15 basis points. Now, this is a point in our module where we need to pause for 1 second and define a term, and that is a basis point. So a basis point is 1/100th of a percent. So 100 basis points is 1%. In our industry, because we deal with these kind of tiny numbers, we use the basis point terminology. So when we say 12 to 15 basis points, that means 0.12% or 0.15%. So if you put that out in decimals, it would be 0.0015, right? 0.0012. And so if you multiply that out, that's what a basis point is. And so again, a tiny amount, but it does add up across billions of dollars in transactions. So the card brands are collecting this network access brand usage fee and the assessment. Now, When do they actually collect this money? Well, as you would suspect, when you hear that term network access brand usage, what happens is every single time the credit card machine in the business, whatever that is, if it's a point of sale system, if it's a terminal, if it's an online gateway, whatever it is, whenever that terminal has a new transaction that it reaches out to authorize, even if that transaction is declined, you're still using the Visa network in order to see if the money is there and get an approval or a decline back. So whereas interchange fees only happen on a completed transaction, the network access brand usage and the assessments from the card brands, that happens every time, whether it's a decline or an approval or even a pre-authorization. Many hotel chains and places like that, they'll run your card with a pre-authorization just to check and make sure you have enough money there and maybe put a hold on it temporarily. Then they'll run the other transaction later for the true amount that you spent at the hotel. When they do that, they're paying Visa or MasterCard, whatever card brand, they're paying the card brand twice. Once to run the pre-auth, and then another time when the actual transaction goes through, okay? So you pay the card brands every time you're accessing the network, this tiny 2 pennies plus 12 to 15 basis points. So that's what the card brands do. In the next video, let's jump in and talk about processors, ISOs. What do these organizations really do, and why are they so crucial to the payments ecosystem?